and welcome to our second installment of History 4890, Contemporary America, 1945 to the present, or more appropriately termed, the Cold War. What we'll be doing for our second lecture here today, now that we have already outlined some theoretical models to understand the origins of the Cold War and the nature of the Cold War, is we'll address primarily the American perspective on where the Cold War came from, to understand how American leaders perceived the Soviet Union not as an ally or a force for peace, but as a potential aggressor who could potentially conquer the world. First of all, we need to define exactly what the Cold War was. I've termed here the Cold War as an era from 1945 to 1989 dominated by the cultural, economic, geographic, political, psychological, and scientific competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. Notice in that definition I did not address the military competition, because military industrial expenditures are going to define every single part of the culture, the economy, the geography, the politics, the psychological perception, and the scientific development of both the United States and the Soviet Union during this era. To understand these tensions fully, we need to utilize Urie Bronfenbrenner's concept of the mirror image. Both sides are going to embrace the same rhetoric to demonize the other and to praise oneself, and that the reality of the Cold War was based upon perception of the opponent and perception of oneself. What's important to understand is, since both sides said that they stood for democracy, peace, and progress, they naturally assumed with mirror image theory that if the other side embraced these same terms, that obviously they were lying and could not be trusted to negotiate in such a complex world as the Cold War. Now telling the Cold War from the orthodox American perspective. Karl Marx was a German philosopher who turned into a dangerous radical revolutionary during the 1840s in Europe. He is known by many as the founder of socialism, an ideology that embraced the idea of applying concepts of equality to economics, not just to politics. For the fact that Karl Marx was such a radical, he was thrown out of every single nation that he ever tried to reside in, until he finally settled down in London, where the British were tolerant of accepting political dissidents. During his life, he became incredibly critical of the market economy and the social inequality that he claimed the market economy created with industrialization. Ignoring the democratic reforms and the increase of standard of living in Western nations, Karl Marx urged workers of the world to unite and to overthrow both capitalism and democracy through revolution. Karl Marx's most eccentric and radical and potentially dangerous follower was a Russian who went by the nickname of Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin is known as the founder of communism. Communism is a political ideology given birth from the socialist movement that argues that the only solution to the world's problems is violent revolution. Vladimir argued that in the opening of the 20th century, industrial nations had entered a new era of imperialism, that the bust and boom cycles of market economies always led to war, and that unless an international revolution occurred under his own leadership, that war would plague humanity for all time. What Vladimir Lenin did during World War I is he manipulated the suffering and the sorrow and the desperation of the Russian people and other Europeans to try and create a political dictatorship where his own minority communist party would impose its will upon the majority of people, claiming that it represented the interests of the majority of people. If we study Vladimir Lenin's writings, though, it becomes obvious that Lenin has no interest in ideas of democracy or equality. In a quote here he states, "Democracy is a fraud, a weapon of falsehood, deception, and violence. We must crush them in order to free humanity from wage slavery. Their resistance must be broken by force." From day number one, communists were nothing but a movement trying to impose their will on the rest of the world through violent upheavals, through systematic oppression, and the creation of one-party dictatorships that would claim liberation, but that in all reality was creating a new form of slavery in the modern world. During World War I, Lenin showed the true nature of his treacherous colors in 1917. In February of 1917, there was a popular democratic revolution in Russia that overthrew the oppressive Tsar and had Russia reborn as a democratic republic. During this time, Vladimir Lenin was residing in Switzerland in political exile. Lenin contacted the government of Imperial Germany and offered his own expertise when it came to revolution and violence, and became an agent of the German Kaiser. The German Kaiser provided Vladimir Lenin with the money and the guns and the support he would need to go back to the new Russian Republic to destroy this new democracy and to assist Germany in claiming victory in World War I. When Lenin returned to Russia, he proceeded with this very dangerous plan. In November of 1917, in what his political party termed a revolution, Vladimir Lenin and the communists overthrew a brand new democracy and instituted a one-party dictatorship not through popular revolution, but through a coup d'etat that overthrew the legitimate government of Russia. To try and spread his ideology of hate and violence, Vladimir Lenin founded an organization in January of 1919 to fund and to organize international revolutions to threaten democracy throughout the world. The Communist International, more popularly known as the Comintern, declared itself and the Russian capital of Moscow to be the central command of the international class war. What the Comintern did was trained, funded, and assisted clandestine terrorist groups throughout the world to threaten international peace and democracy. In this context, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States was forced, along with Winston Churchill of Great Britain, to try and intervene in the Russian Civil War, to try and crush Lenin's regime, and to stop the spread of communism, which threatened democracy and freedom throughout the world. The power of propaganda. President Wilson, while he was trying to save democracy and save the Russian people from tyranny, by advocating and endorsing systematic involvement of the United States in the Russian Civil War, accidentally offered the communists the propaganda trump card that they needed. And when Lenin's most devout disciple, the Georgian brute who went by the nickname of Stalin, which means man of steel, when he seized power in 1928, he was bent upon the idea of building up the Russian military so that in the future he could send Russian armies throughout the world to overthrow democracies to institute communist dictatorships. He used the pretense of American intervention in the Russian Civil War as a propaganda to excuse to the Russian people to say that he, Joseph Stalin, was protecting them from the outside world. The reality is, Stalin utilized this brutal dictatorship to enslave the Russian people. And when the Wall Street market crash happened in 1929, triggering the Great Depression throughout Europe and the United States, Joseph Stalin attempted to utilize his newfound military force to export the Soviet system throughout the entire free world. Leading up to the rise of Adolf Hitler in 1933, communists in Germany intentionally tried to destabilize that nation as much as possible to inflict suffering upon the German people, hoping that they would fall for the communist trick and to support the communists in a violent overthrow of the German Weimar Republic. When Adolf Hitler was first brought to power in March of 1933, the German people did not support him because of his plan to persecute Jews. They supported him because he was a vehement anti-communist who believed in using whatever means necessary of violence, and particularly the power of the state, to crush out the communist movement and to protect the Western world. What became very obvious, though, is once he crushed his domestic opponents in the form of the German Communist Party, that both totalitarian leaders threatened world peace and security. While some claimed throughout the 1930s that Stalin and Hitler were enemies, they showed their true colors in August of 1939 when they signed what has become notoriously known as the Hitler-Stalin Pact. While they attempted to play it off as a non-aggression pact, the reality of what occurred in the signing of this is these two brutal tyrants took the defenseless nation of Poland and split it in half, overthrowing the legitimate government of Poland and laying the basis now for World War II. For the fact that Poland was now being threatened by the two totalitarian leaders, Great Britain and France declared war upon Nazi Germany to protect their Polish ally. In addition, since they believed that Stalin was directing Hitler's aggression in the future towards the West, and that he may also, in the future, join Adolf Hitler in his crusade against the West, Great Britain and France clandestinely assisted Finnish patriots when they resisted a Soviet invasion in December of 1939. Perhaps one of the greatest problems in evaluating this era is that many American patriots look back on the 1930s and they are critical of President Roosevelt when it comes to his domestic policies and the New Deal, not recognizing that the true threat and danger of the Roosevelt administration was their foreign policy. Since President Roosevelt had identified Nazi Germany as the main threat to American peace and security, despite the fact that Adolf Hitler never once threatened the United States and sought an alliance with the United States, President Roosevelt naively condemned Nazi aggression and held back any critiques of the Soviet Union at the outbreak of World War II. To compound the danger of this situation, President Roosevelt added his Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, as his vice presidential running mate in the 1940 election. For the fact that Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented third term in office, the American people emphasized the controversy of that decision and paid little attention to the reality of who Henry Wallace was. Throughout the 1930s, Henry Wallace had been known as an open sympathizer with the Communist Party of the United States. And when he toured throughout Latin America during the 1940s, He met with communist leaders there and promoted tolerance and unity. When he toured the Soviet Union, he came back with false reports about how the Soviet Union was essentially just like the United States, that it was a workers' utopia, and that Joseph Stalin was an ally with the interests of the world in mind, and who could be trusted in the future against Nazi Germany. What President Roosevelt did in June of 1941 was he subverted the will of Congress and misapplied funds from American taxpayers in the Lend-Lease program. Congress had approved the Lend-Lease program in March of 1941 to give Great Britain dire economic and military assistance that they needed in the form of loans and in the form of equipment. For the fact that President Roosevelt was now directing American resources in the war against Nazi Germany, even though we were not officially part of the war, he extended out this logic in June of 1941 and started assisting the Soviet Union on the same level that he did our British allies. When Senator Harry S. Truman of Missouri heard that Hitler had broken the Hitler-Stalin Pact and had launched an invasion deep into the heart of Russia, he gave a realistic assessment of the situation and condemned President Roosevelt for extending out Lend-Lease. On the floor of the U.S. Senate, he took a definitive stand against Roosevelt's policy of being soft on communism and simply said, "Let them kill off as many of each other as possible." What Truman identified is that both the Nazis and the communists were threats to freedom and democracy and peace, and to allow these two tyrannical regimes essentially to kill each other off. President Roosevelt disagreed. In all reality, President Roosevelt helped to weaken our British ally when he forced Winston Churchill to embrace the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter defined that after World War II, all nations throughout the world, including European colonies, would be granted freedom and had the right to self-determination. What this meant was Joseph Stalin, if he wanted to, could try and export communism throughout the world through the front of anti-colonialism. In December of 1941, after the Japanese foolishly attacked our naval base at Pearl Harbor, the United States entered into World War II officially. And Roosevelt ignored pleas that he be firm with both Stalin and with Churchill. Roosevelt trying to deal with them on same level as equal partners in this war who could be trusted as allies. In November of 1943, President Roosevelt had opportunity, along with Winston Churchill, to meet Joseph Stalin for the first time at the Tehran Conference. While President Roosevelt had the ability at this conference to take a firm stance against the Man of Steel, he decided instead to back down and to pander to Stalin's will when Stalin pushed undemocratic ideas about the future of Poland. The reason why Roosevelt did this was, number one, a naive understanding of who Joseph Stalin was. By the end of the Tehran Conference, he had started lovingly referring to Stalin as Uncle Joe to try and build up a friendship. He also thought that he would need Soviet assistance in the future in a war against Japan. When Joseph Stalin agreed to assist in the future with the Japanese War, President Roosevelt agreed that the Western Front would be opened during the summer of 1944, and American troops would launch an invasion of the European continent to assist our Soviet allies in the liberation of Europe. Luckily, not all members of the Democratic Party were as naive as President Roosevelt in their evaluation of the dangers of communism. During the Democratic National Convention of 1944, when President Roosevelt announced that he would be running for an unprecedented fourth term in office, Democratic leaders made sure that Henry Wallace would not be part of that ticket. They understood that Henry Wallace would endanger American security in the future through his pro-Soviet and pro-communist attitudes. By removing Henry Wallace, they brought to power one of the greatest patriots and anti-communists the United States has ever known, Senator Harry S. Truman. What began to unfold after this were some potentially dangerous precedents. In October of 1944, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin secretly met in Moscow. At this time, Stalin began to reveal his true colors of wanting world domination and the expansion of the Russian Empire. For the fact that Winston Churchill was very empathetic to the idea of empire, the two men proposed that Eastern Europe and Southern Europe be divided into spheres of influence to expand the security of the British Empire and to expand the influence of the Soviet Empire. The problem in this scenario is at this point, President Roosevelt was the only leader in this coalition who could intervene and take a firm stance against both forms of imperialism. In February of 1945, the Big Three met at the Yalta Conference to talk about the future of Germany, the future of Poland, and the future of the world. At this conference, they agreed that Germany, due to starting 2 world wars in 1 century, could not be united, and that Germany would be split into a French, a British, an American, and a Soviet zone of occupation, and that the brand new founded United Nations would utilize the power of the UN Security Council to act as a police force throughout the world to make sure that World War II finally was the war to end all wars. When Churchill and Roosevelt talked about the future of Poland, Stalin completely rejected the idea of Poland having any form of democracy. He perceived Poland to be a threat to the Soviet Union and stated that he would not accept democratic elections. Instead of taking a firm stance against the brutal dictator, Roosevelt and Churchill instead decided to agree to disagree on the issue of Poland, believing that they could resolve this matter in the future. While the death of President Roosevelt on April 12, 1945, was a great tragedy for the American people and the free world, luckily, we had Harry S. Truman to take up Roosevelt's mantle and to set the country in a more proper course. Unlike Roosevelt, Truman had no naivety when it came to the evils of communism and the nature of the Soviet Union. In his first day in office, he was warned by Secretary Harriman that the Soviet Union was consistently violating the agreements that had been set out at Yalta, and that the only way you could deal with the Soviets was to take a firm stance. For the fact that the Red Army was only 3 days outside of Berlin, Harry S. Truman was nervous about the future of Europe and this alliance. Luckily, Truman was informed that the Americans had an ace up their sleeve. At this point, the Manhattan Project had now developed the world's first nuclear bomb. What this bomb would allow Truman to do in the future if he decided was to bring the war to a swift end in the Pacific, and to also be used as a shield to protect the rest of the world from any potential threats from the Soviet Union. On April 23, 1945, President Harry S. Truman, one of the greatest patriots America has ever known, set our country on a proper course in his first meeting with Foreign Secretary Molotov of the Soviet Union. As one can assume from his name, which has become synonymous with violence and the Molotov cocktail, Molotov was a supporter of violence, and in many ways one of the greatest terrorists of that era. Despite this being his very first meeting with any foreign officials, President Truman took a firm stance, and instead of giving in to ludicrous Soviet demands, he took a stand in the name of Poland, freedom, and democracy, and scolded Molotov for the actions of the Soviet Red Army in Eastern Europe. Molotov replied tersely, "I have never been talked to in such a manner." Truman promptly responded, "If you kept your agreements, I would not have to talk to you like this." By taking a firm stance and relating such a stance to Foreign Secretary Molotov, Truman sprang out a message to Joseph Stalin that the United States would not abandon Europe to communist aggression. Luckily for Truman, a German patriot came to his aid. While General Reinhard Gehlen was claimed by the Soviets to be a war criminal, the reality of Reinhard Gehlen is he was one of the top intelligence officers in the entire world, and that he had disagreed with Hitler from day one on the persecution of Jews with the Holocaust. The main mission that inspired Reinhard Gehlen was to destroy international communism and to stop any threats that Stalin might have against the Western world. For the last several years of the war, Reinhard Gehlen microfilmed secret German and Soviet documents to show definitively that the American government was full of communist spies. What he asserted, based upon his claims of utilizing Soviet intelligence, was the Soviet Union could not be trusted. As evidenced further in the 1950s with Senator Joseph McCarthy, there was an internal danger in the United States, a threat from within being fueled by a nation that claimed to be our ally. At this point, now that Truman had the evidence he needed, as he could support the idea of a firm anti-communist commitment of the United States to protect the rest of the world. In July of 1945, Harry Truman was granted another great gift. In an amazing turn of fate, on the day that the Potsdam Conference opened, there was a general election in Great Britain, and Winston Churchill's party lost the election. This meant that Winston Churchill was no longer Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he was sent home to be replaced by a new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. Clement Attlee agreed with Harry Truman on many things. In particular, he was a vehement anti-communist. He was very much against the violent aspects of the British Empire, and he wanted to make sure that Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin did not set up spheres of influence and create new empires that would threaten the very foundations of Western civilization. The main sticking points initially that the Allies talked about was number one, the division of Germany, and number two, if the Soviet Union would now assist the United States in defeating Japan. While Germany had only been under occupation for just a few months, It had already become clear to both Truman and to Attlee that the division of Germany was a mistake, and that the Soviet zones of occupation had now become the front lines in a potential battle for world domination, and that if you allowed the Soviets to assist in the defeat of Japan, that any territories where the Soviet Red Army occupied, that the Soviets would impose communist dictatorships, and that the Soviet Union would force the United States into starting a third world war to liberate the peoples of Japan and other nations throughout the world. When it came down to the issue of Poland, Clement Attlee and Harry S. Truman took a firm stance on the protection of democracy and having free elections in the Polish nation. Joseph Stalin was incredibly hostile to this concept, showing his true colors and his distrust of democracy and his vision of a future communist dictatorship in Poland. In order to save thousands, if not perhaps millions, of lives of American soldiers, Harry Truman took the fateful decision of utilizing the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb at this point was the most deadly weapon humanity had ever created. And on August 6th, the little boy A-bomb was dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At this point, Truman declared that if Japan surrendered immediately, without conditions, that such attacks would stop. But if they did not, he claimed the United States had enough bombs of similar capacity to destroy the entirety of Japan. On August 9th, he tried to back up this bluff by dropping the Fat Man atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki. And his bluff worked. The United States only had 2 atomic bombs, but Japan did not know this. On August 15th, they agreed to surrender and gave the United States an official surrender on September 2nd, officially bringing an end to World War II. And while Harry Truman had to make a very brutal decision, as we learned later in the Vietnam War, sometimes such policies are justified, and the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki saved the Japanese people from further deaths in World War II and the potential of having to live under a communist dictatorship. Sometimes, in order to save the village from communism, the village must first be destroyed. The problem for Truman in advancing now in the cause of peace is that Soviet troops had already arrived in the Korean Peninsula, liberating it from the Japanese, but imposing their own political will on the Korean people. To stop the Soviets from furthering their aggression, Harry Truman took the fateful decision of immediately cutting off all Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviets to make sure that American equipment could not be used to oppress innocent people. And when General Hodge arrived in September of 1945 to Korea, he quickly realized that his American soldiers were outnumbered. For the fact that the Japanese had a very, very long history of fighting Russians, and that the Japanese leaders, particularly their military leaders, were also devout anti-communists, General Hodge took the practical decision of befriending one who previously had been our enemy as an ally, to bolster up American forces and to protect South Korea from any potential communist aggression. The great debate of 1945 and 1946 then is the question, can the Soviets be trusted? Secretary of State Hull said to President Harry S. Truman that the Soviets absolutely could not be trusted. That you could not allow the Soviets to occupy any more territory, because once you handed over territory to Soviet occupation, the Soviets would not go home. And that once again, these people would need outside liberation. When it came down to the resistance movements, and particularly the partisans of Nazi-occupied Europe, Secretary Hull said that the Soviets were simply manipulating these resistance movements to try and extend out Soviet power throughout the European continent, and that Stalin was a man of steel who could only understand an iron fist, and he planned on oppressing the people of the world with an iron fist. That the only way to fight fire is with fire. And that if Stalin wanted to use an iron fist against the peoples of Europe, that President Roosevelt needed to forge a steel fist, stamped with "Made in the USA," to play hardball against Stalin, and to show him that we were serious on stopping the spread of communism, and that if necessary we would use preemptive aggression to contain the threats the Soviets could possibly give to the world. In the opening of 1946, the worst fears of Truman and other anti-communist leaders started coming true. By this point, Mao Zedong, who had claimed to be our ally in the struggle of China against the Japanese aggressor, Mao Zedong began a civil war in China, which threatened our other ally, Chiang Kai-shek. Within Greece, where the population was desperately starving from the period of Nazi occupation, communists utilized this period of chaos to try and overthrow the newly appointed Greek government through acts of terrorism and violence. On January 11, 1946, the small nation of Albania fell to the communists. On January 31st, Yugoslavia, which had been the model of national self-determination and Woodrow Wilson's 10 points, also fell to the communists. And on February 9th, Stalin made his vision clear when he stated, "The capitalist system of world economy conceals elements of crisis and war. The Soviet system provides collaboration amongst nations." What Stalin was attempting to do through propaganda and rhetoric was to take advantage of the war weariness of European populations and offering them the illusion of peace and security, when the reality is all the Soviet system had to offer people was oppression and tyranny. And on March 5th, 1946, in President Truman's hometown of Fulton, Missouri, Winston Churchill openly declared a Cold War against the Soviet Union in his now notorious Iron Curtain speech. Churchill stated, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent." For the fact that Churchill was intimately aware of the dangers and evils of communism, he gave this speech to help solidify American public opinion in taking an anti-Soviet stance, and to try and win over the British public to take a stand side by side with their American brethren in a common cause to maintain freedom, security, and democracy throughout the world. President Truman's new vision was also given support from the diplomatic community. George Kennan, perhaps one of the most talented diplomats of the 20th century, wrote to the American president on February 22, 1946, in what has notoriously become known as the Long Telegram. In this telegram, Kennan clearly stated, quote, The Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is the traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. Russian leaders have learned to seek security only in patient but deadly struggle for the total destruction of rival power. George Kennan's words revealed the distinct, deadly nature of the Soviet regime, and that the Russians would be bent upon total destruction of any power that tried to stand in their way, and that the only way to save the world from these threats was to contain the Soviet Union by placing American and Allied troops in every bordering nation of the Soviet Union to prevent those nations from falling to Soviet aggression and tyranny. At this point, Harry Truman reacted to this new Soviet threat and made the fateful decision of consolidating the British, the French, and the American zones of western parts of Germany into a brand new democratic nation known as the Federal Republic of Germany, under the Christian leader Konrad Adenauer. Truman also pushed for recovery of the European economic and political systems and to normalize relations with nations that had previously been thought of as enemies. He believed that by bringing things back to normal in Europe, he could undercut any potential attraction that communism might hold for the suffering people of Europe, and to prevent further communist expansion by investing in the reconstruction of Western Europe. In 1947, the communists continued to push forward in their path of world domination. In the areas previously known as French Indochina, now known as Vietnam, a radical nationalist who embraced the ideas of communism began to lead a violent revolution of the Vietnamese people that was inflicting greater harm and suffering upon these people. And when the French came back to assist their former colony in maintaining security, Ho Chi Minh declared war upon what he called the French invader, trying to transform Vietnam into a Stalinist-style communist dictatorship. In this same year, Bulgaria, Poland, and Romania all also felt communism, and a great fear came about that communism would soon embrace all of Eastern Europe. To make matters worse, in France and in Italy, the communist parties of these nations had become the largest political parties in these nations. French and Italian citizens naively associated with communists with the resistance movements, not recognizing the true nature and danger that the communists held when it came to the future of their nations. What Harry Truman did is in March of 1947, and one of the most important doctrines since the Monroe Doctrine, Truman took a firm stance for freedom. In a speech to Congress, he stated, "The USA will support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." What Harry Truman convinced Congress to do was to give economic and military aid, first to Greece in their resistance against the communists, but then further extending the logic to any nation throughout the world that was resisting communist aggression. To solidify his commitment to freedom, President Truman also helped to create a plan that is now known as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was introduced in July of 1947, where Americans altruistically offered to provide the economic aid and materials to reconstruct the European continent. What Truman also offered with this was a larger plan to create pan-European cooperation through free markets, through capitalism, and democratic institutions, laying the basis for the future development of what we now know as the European Union. What Truman asserted was that capitalism, aligned with democracy and aligned with free trade, would create a scenario where Europeans would never go to war with each other again, and that World War III would never happen. But in order to receive this aid, there were political strings attached. While some Europeans claimed that this was a rigging of their democracies, Harry Truman was correct in assessing that he was actually saving the future of democracy in Western Europe. In cases like France, Harry Truman stated that before nations could receive American economic aid, that they must remove all communists from their government, even if they had naively been democratically elected by French citizens. Luckily for Truman, President Charles de Gaulle saw the wisdom in such a move, and despite threats of a general strike from French unions, Charles de Gaulle threw the communists out of government, took American economic aid, and by 1949 had almost fully reconstructed the French nation. What's important to understand about Truman and his legacy is that unlike other politicians who fell for the naive positive slogans and propaganda of communism, Harry S. Truman saw it for what it really was. Not a force for the liberation of oppressed peoples throughout the world, but an evil trickery to oppress even more freedom-loving people throughout the world.